Hi there everybody, welcome to the first of 6 sessions which I'm entitling Principles in Curriculum Design. My name's Alex Ford, I'm a Schools History Project Fellow and a lecturer at Leeds Trinity University. And I suppose the aim of the sessions that I've set up here are to give you a bit of an introduction and a bit of an overview about this issue of curriculum and why so many people are talking about curriculum at the moment. This is particularly aimed at you if you are new into teaching, maybe a trainee, maybe you've recently qualified and you want to kind of get your head around all the big questions around curriculum, but equally there are things here if you are more experienced or you're a senior leader or a middle leader about curriculum design and what that really means in practice. So just to give you a brief overview of where these sessions are going, these are the 6 that I think I would like to cover. We're beginning with this big question of why curriculum? Why are we all talking about it at the moment? Then moving on to think about particular models of curriculum. So what actually do we talk about? What is curriculum? When we talk about the curriculum, what do we mean? And we're going to look at 2 broad models of that, traditional curricula and the progressive curriculum. And then we're going to think about whether there is an alternative to that. And we'll look at the third way in curriculum thinking, and we'll think about a disciplinary model of curriculum. And then in the final 2 sessions, we will get onto some things that are more particularly related to history teaching, which of course is my specialism. Now those things are relevant or may well be relevant if you teach other subjects as well, but those are the more subject specific entries. The first 4, however, are relevant, I hope, whatever subject you teach. Okay, so the first session I want to think about is this question of why curriculum. Those of you who've spent any time at all in schools will know that curriculum is a hot topic. Everybody's talking about curriculum. Everybody's talking about this idea of how do we structure our curriculum? What should our curriculum contain? We might hear terms like powerful knowledge thrown around. We might hear a lot of talk about sequencing and structuring of curriculum for memory and for learning. And there's a whole range of things that are being discussed. And we want to think about, well, why is that? Why is everybody suddenly talking about curriculum now? Or rather, I should say, people have been talking about curriculum always, but why is it suddenly such a key topic at the moment? And we're going to think about that in several ways. Why should we be focusing on curriculum? Why is it so important? And we're going to have a think about why that actually is. Hopefully, this will give you a starting point if you're a new teacher as well, into thinking about some of these big questions and big issues. And most importantly for me, it will enable you to have meaningful conversations about curriculum. So obviously we'll go into more detail about curriculum as we go through the later sessions, but this one hopefully puts it on your radar and gives you a sense that maybe you can start having those conversations in whatever school you are currently working in, whether or not you have a curriculum responsibility. And for me, that's a really powerful thing to have teachers talking about curriculum, and curriculum thinking can make a real difference in schools. So if we want to think about why curriculum is a hot topic in schools at the moment, and particularly for senior leaders in schools at the moment, I think we probably need to go back to the Ofsted framework and how that's shifted and how that's changed, beginning officially in 2019, and then obviously with some preceding work that went into that. And I'm going to cover this quite briefly because I think you can go and find out a lot about the Ofsted the Ofsted framework. If you go on the Ofsted website, there's lots of information there about the Ofsted framework. But where did it come from? Well, there were some big shifts in Ofsted when Amanda Spielman took over. And some of the research that she wanted to do into schools was to say, well, what is it that makes education effective? And there was a kind of worry that what Ofsted had been inspecting for a long time, which was predominantly results, school results and outcomes, was not getting at the heart of what made a good education. And anyone who's worked in schools for any amount of time will know there's lots of criticism of just focusing on exam results as the sole guiding factor in saying whether or not a school is doing a good job or not, largely because you could do a fantastic job with your students but still struggle to get really good exam results if you have a whole range of other socioeconomic factors that might be feeding into that. Equally, you might be doing a fantastic job getting outcomes and results, but at the same time you're doing that via very particular methods to get those results that might not actually represent a really good education. And so the research that Ofsted commissioned beginning in 2017 was really to look into what made a high quality education. And what they discover is, in the course of this, I'm not going to go through everything that I've put on here, but what they discover, what they make the case for as they go through all of this, is that curriculum is at the heart of a really good education. And that is quite interesting, because what they found was the quality of a curriculum didn't always correlate directly with the outcomes a school got in terms of, say, GCSE exam results. So what they found, there was a real lack of understanding about curriculum. They found that quite often curriculum was being perverted in order to produce the exam results a school needed to survive in the accountability system that Ofsted had created for it by itself, and in terms of school league tables and everything else. And there's a recognition, a very brief recognition, admittedly, that Ofsted had been part of a culture of performance, which had led to curriculum being losing its focus in what schools were doing. Okay, and there was a great concern that was found in amongst this, that what that was resulting in was, in the areas where students were coming from more disadvantaged background, the curriculum was being narrowed to such an extent that in both primary and secondary schools, students from more disadvantaged backgrounds were studying fewer subjects, in less depth sometimes in terms of foundation subjects, and spending much more time doing things like their English and maths and science at the expense of other things, or even worse, spending an awful lot of time doing exam drill and practice at the expense of rich and broad learning. And so Spielman, over the course of 2017, 2018, into 2019, was talking about why this change was needed in terms of the Ofsted framework, i.e. that the Ofsted framework would now put curriculum right at its centre. And she argues this, basically, that there was not enough really detailed thinking happening about what we want pupils to learn. All the thinking was about how can we ensure particular outcomes, rather than what do we want students to know, what do we want them to be able to do, what's important for them, in all kinds of ways. So what's important for them for the exam, but also what's important for them as children, what's important for them as citizens in a particular community, what's important for wider issues of social justice, maybe social mobility. And she kind of makes the case that the Ofsted research found that there was a great narrowing of curriculum in terms of ignoring things for test preparation, as we discussed a minute ago. And this included things that we see that are now really commonplace but didn't used to be, like 2-year Key Stage 3 in order to start GCSEs early, reducing again the amount of entitlement that students have. So whereas students in optional subjects, like history, like geography, like art, for example, like music, whereas students had historically had an entitlement to study those things up to the end of year 9, some of them were now dropping those subjects at the end of year 8 in order to narrow down and focus on just a handful of GCSE subjects. So she argues this is a great problem, and this is the justification for the change in the Ofsted framework, to focus not solely on outcomes but on the content of the taught curriculum as well. And I think this is probably the bit that put the shift in place, because this was Spielman making the case that this wasn't going to be just a nice little extra they were going to start looking at, but there was going to be a real shift in the way Ofsted inspected. And so she talks here about those of us who work in education should be clear these practices, that is curriculum narrowing, focusing on the tests only, do not represent a substantial education. The curriculum isn't the timetable, nor is it what's on the exam. We have to ask ourselves how we've ended up in this situation. And basically this is Spielman saying, if you are a school that basically is an exam factory and your aim is just to get exam results, and you don't think more broadly than that about the breadth and the balance and the entitlement all students should have to a broad and balanced set of knowledge in their Key Stage 3 curriculum and their Key Stage 2 curriculum, their Key Stage 4 curriculum and so on, then this is going to be a problem. And up until 2018, that hadn't been a problem for schools. It was about the results. If the results were good, nobody really looked into, or certainly haven't been for the last 15 years, nobody really looked into what you were teaching. In fact, in all my time as a head of department and as a history teacher, not one Ofsted inspection. I was inspected in Ofsted inspections, in an RI school, in an inadequate school, in a good school, in an outstanding school, and in none of those situations did I ever have a conversation about what we taught. We had a lot of conversations about what our results were and what our interventions were to ensure better results. So this is a real big shift. That is one reason why this has come front and centre. So let's just take a brief moment to have a look at what's changed in terms of the Ofsted Framework 2019. Now, if you're new to schools, then this will be the only framework you know, but if you're not, then this is a quite significant change. there are four basic, so there's always been, well, recently there have been four elements that have been assessed in Ofsted frameworks. These are the four that will be there in the new framework, in the current framework: quality of education, behaviour and attitudes, personal development, leadership and management. And the quality of education area is broken down into three sub areas, and these are the ones that are causing schools all kinds of concerns and worries, and maybe leading to some panic, some necessary panic, and potentially also some unnecessary panic, because actually when we start breaking them down, they're not actually that complicated. Now, if you don't know previous frameworks, I'm going to put this up because this will show you where we've come from. This is the last framework that we had for Ofsted, and you will see that it's substantially different. So under the old framework, we had four areas. I'm just going to highlight very briefly on here, just so you can see what we're looking at. We had the effectiveness of leadership and management was at the heart of the old framework, and everything kind of stemmed from this idea. It was a very kind of New Labour, Tony Blair, 1997, that idea that inspirational leaders would direct what schools would be and do. And from that, therefore, everything else kind of stemmed. So the quality of teaching, learning, assessment came next. Personal development, behaviour and welfare, and outcomes for children and other learners was an entire category in its own right. And arguably, that is the one that got the most emphasis, in the sense that as long as the leadership looked good and the outcomes were good, the school was considered to be doing a good job. And quality of teaching ended up turning into a bit of a mishmash because it depended who you got in as an inspector as to what they looked like. So what one inspector thought was good quality teaching or good quality learning really differed to what another one would think. And I can remember having conversations in my time with an Ofsted inspector who'd suggested that maybe I should, rather than talking about, I was actually teaching something about the English Reformation to year 8s, and his suggestion was that he'd once seen an A-level lesson in which the teacher had turned the entire room into Lenin's office for the lesson. So I'm not sure how helpful that was, but he was not very impressed with the way I taught, and so in terms of how I'd approached it, he thought there should be more discovery happening, and that was his suggestion. Anyway, my personal gripes aside, let's go on to how this is different then. So in the new model, we have at the heart quality of education. Leadership and management now comes fourth in that list. It's not unimportant, but it really interestingly, we start with the quality of education. And that becomes the primary driver for saying how well is this school doing. And in quality of education, we see a number of things. Intent, i.e. what is the curriculum setting out to do? Is it really clear what's trying to be achieved? Implementation, is that intent actually being realized? So if we're saying we want, at a whole school level, maybe we want to teach this breadth of subjects and this kind of this is the values that we want to embed in our curriculum, or at a subject level it might be these are the particular units we think are important and why. The implementation then is more about the teaching, and the question with the implementation is not about some arbitrary judgment on what's about quality of teaching, for example, here, but it's saying, does that implementation support the curriculum intent? So if you're saying we want to achieve these things, does what teachers then do in the classroom support that? Now, we can debate that, but this is the way it's going. And the impact then is saying, well, this is what you intended. Does it achieve those things? And to be honest, also impact encompasses that outcomes for learners. So the outcomes for learners, the exam results, goes under this. So rather than being an entire category in their own right, they now sit underneath that bigger question of what all of this is. This whole thing here is basically curriculum. So just to briefly give you a sense of how that will look in practice, Spielman has sort of said under the new model, inspection should feel that it's done with leaders and teachers rather than being done to them. I.e., this is about going out and saying, here's what we're doing. How is it working? Are we managing to get across the curriculum that we want to? I'm not sure inspection will ever feel like that, but hey ho. The huge difference here, in the old system, you might have got an Ofsted inspector, came into your lesson for 20 minutes, went out again, and really we're looking for those things about, is the quality of teaching what they think is good quality teaching? Because this is all about curriculum, the inspection now has to look in much more depth at curriculum. So lots of the things about top level view will just be about the big curriculum planning for a school. How does a school ensure that everybody gets access to a broad and balanced curriculum? How does the school make sure that disadvantaged students don't have their curriculum narrowed too soon or end up being taken out of all other lessons just to do more maths and English to get the GCSE grades for the school as opposed to for the good of the students? And that might be the defining or the distinguishing feature there. So we get that top level view, and then we get these deep dives. And the deep dive is the idea that the inspectorate are not going to try and sample lessons from every subject when they come in. What they're going to do is choose several subjects, 3, 4, maybe 5, and they're going to visit those subjects in a lot of depth. And they're going to look at the taught curriculum and the planned curriculum, and they're going to say, okay, what are you trying to do with this curriculum? How is it working? Are you actually implementing it in an effective way? How do you know the impact of your curriculum planning? And this is the bit, because schools have been so focused on exam results, for all the reasons we talked about already, and quite right, I'm not criticising schools for this, but because they've been so focused on exam results, has there been that kind of curriculum thinking around what we want to teach and why we want to teach it? And actually, the Ofsted curriculum research probably says, probably not in a lot of schools, actually. Slightly more so in secondary schools for foundation subjects, and slightly more so in primary schools for other subjects, actually. So there's some really interesting research that came out of that. I've written about it before, but that is the big change. So there's this great fear, because teachers are going to be asked to talk about in depth what they teach and why they teach it and how they get it across and why they do it in that way and how they know it's effective. Now, to me, that's really good teaching. Because if you know what you're teaching and why you're teaching it and how you know that it's working, and you know how you do it differently next time, or how this bit of what you're teaching supports that bit you're doing later, then actually that is just really good teaching. But there's always a fear, I think, that when you are in leadership of school, again, you've got to think about, are we going to be able to articulate this well? Are we going to be able to talk about this well? Because if we can't, it's difficult for an inspector coming in for a couple of days of visit to read between the lines. People need to be able to talk the talk of curriculum, I think, also to get recognition that they are doing these things and doing the really good teaching things. Equally, I think it also quickly catches out schools where there hasn't been enough thinking, and what has been curriculum has been, well, we do a GCSE at the end of year 11. We start them on GCSE in year 8 because we want the results. We teach them in year 7 and 8, basically the same as they're going to do at GCSE, so they can embed more knowledge. That to me is narrow curriculum thinking, and there are schools who do that. They are a minority, but this kind of inspection system is designed to say that's not good enough anymore. So let's talk about some practical things that teachers could do actually to prepare for this new type of inspection and think about, you know, the curriculum issues. You'll find this linked in the pack down in the links below. When Ofsted did some of their curriculum research, these are some things they found about where curriculum thinking was working really well. And really, there's just a set of challenges for you to think about these things in particular detail. So where things were working well, teachers were able to articulate invaluable knowledge, so really key, important knowledge in their subject areas without saying, well, it's important because it's on the spec. They might say things like, oh, it's important we study this now because later we're going to study that. And if they don't understand this, this, and this here, they won't be able to understand that, that, and that there. So those kinds of thinking bits. So when we talk about curricular sequencing and key knowledge and powerful knowledge, or knowledge with power, these are the kinds of things we talk about here. So there's some activities to do with that. Teachers were able to explain how particular concepts and knowledge underpin and enable future learning. So again, that's kind of connected with the previous point. They had a good grasp of developments in cognitive psychology. Now, there's no space to talk about that here. There's loads and loads of great resources on understanding cognitive psychology and how the brain functions in learning, or how we think the brain functions in learning. And I'll put some links to those in the description as well. But that idea of how is it your mind makes sense of things, or what do we think is happening in your mind when that happens, and how do we embed that into the way that we teach? Now, you will see a lot of this at the moment in terms of knowledge recall type stuff. That is a really small part of grasping cognitive psychology and how the brain functions in learning. Can I really recommend you go beyond just the headline stuff about test, recall, and the more you test and recall, the better they'll get. It is much, much more than that, and it includes things like social contexts, how we learn in societies, but in that idea of learning communities, so that students don't learn in isolation in a tiny little bubble. They learn as part of a group of people learning together as well. And there are lots of things that will impact that. Number 4, teachers were able to explain how they delivered a full curriculum for all pupils. So this is relevant both at a school level but also at a subject level. So what do you cover and why do you miss things out? So for me, the big question always is, if you are in a history department and you don't teach the French Revolution, why don't you? Because to me, that comes under this category of really invaluable knowledge. It doesn't matter if you only teach it very briefly, actually. But I think if you don't teach it, it's really hard for students to understand a lot of what happens in terms of that post-revolutionary thinking that leads to all kinds of things, such as the creation of the United States and so on and so forth. So for me, that is a really important topic. It's really hard though. So the question is, if you're not teaching it, why you're not teaching it? What's your reason? If it's just because it's too hard for my students, well, the question is, how can you make it accessible? How can you help them to understand it? How can you get an access point that will build them up? Or what's the acceptable simplification that will allow them to understand it to an appropriate level to enable them to do things later on? And then finally, teachers were able to discuss progression in their subject area as a matter of cumulative curriculum knowledge, and were able to make good use of assessment without focusing solely on exams. I think this is a really crucial one, because we have become so embedded in the way of thinking about progress being moving from a GCSE grade to another grade. You know, they started at a grade 4 and now they're at a grade 5, or their last assessment was a grade 3 and now they've got a grade 6. And actually, that is a really poor proxy for learning. So the idea and the kind of buzz phrase that Ofsted has at the moment is the curriculum is the progression model, i.e. if you set out a load of things in a really well planned curriculum, and you can say that students have learnt them because you've done some, you know, assessment and teacher assessment and formative assessment and maybe some formal assessments, you can say they're learning those things and you're happy they're learning them to a good degree, then they are making progress. So that's the kind of fundamental concept of that. And it's not about creating artificial level ladders and all sorts of things. And there's lots you could read on that as well. But it's more than just saying the curriculum is the progression model. It's about knowing what in your curriculum allows students to progress, both in terms of their knowledge and in terms of their disciplinary skills, so the things in the subject that help them to understand. So in history, it would be about, you know, writing causally, or structuring argument, or being able to draw inferences from particular sources. In other subjects, it's going to be very different things. So there's a lot of subject specificity in the way this works as well. But things like that will help you to prepare, I think. I think if we really want to understand where Ofsted are coming from with this, we need to think about some of the issues that there have been in leadership of the curriculum over the years. So one of the things I think that would be really useful if you are working in a school at the moment, or you've been in as a trainee, is just having a think about how curriculum has been led in your context. Now, it might be that it's been led exceptionally well, but quite often you'll find there's some quite confused thinking about how curriculum should be led, is being led, and so on. Okay, what is curriculum leadership then? Well, there's an enormous lack of clarity. Just like there's an enormous lack of clarity on what curriculum is, understanding what people are doing when they lead curriculum has a whole range of issues and confusions around it as well. And that means there's some very mixed approaches. What I want to do here is outline 3 broad approaches I think you'll find in lots of schools, often in different measures, so you will see different things at different points and maybe in different contexts, and sometimes all 3 working together or against each other. Some of these approaches are, well, all of these approaches are problematic, and we'll look at the ways in which they're problematic. Some of them have been actively damaging to the quality of education that many students have received in schools, and therefore I think it's worth being aware of them, even if you're not in a position of being a direct curriculum leader in the kind of formal sense. So the 3 models I wanted to go through quite quickly are a detached model, a centralized model, and what I'm calling a siege model of curriculum leadership. And they work a little bit like this. So if we think about a detached model of curriculum leadership, this is what you might find in more traditional school settings. And I think probably it's that version which is kind of do least harm approach. So what do we have? Well, we have centrally a timetable, and the timetable effectively sets out some parameters in which, you know, your subjects can operate. So they tend to be, you know, the timetable will allow English so much time, math so much time, art so much time. And beyond that, the central element of curriculum leadership doesn't really impinge on what happens in each of those individual subjects. So if we think about senior curriculum leaders, as in on the SLT, they are setting out the parameters for, right, this is the block of time you have, and you obviously need to get your students through with the various exams that we're going to sit by the end of their time with us. But other than that, we are detaching ourselves from it. So senior leaders step themselves out of it and they let heads of subject decide what to include. And I've worked in a school like that, actually. What kinds of benefits does that have? Well, actually, in terms of damage, in some ways, this is probably the least damage of the three models I'm going to talk through here. There is lots and lots of freedom there for subjects to develop very specific, appropriate curricula for their subject areas, so that the head of English can go away and they can decide what books they want to study. They can decide, if they're going to do something a very traditional curriculum where they look at maybe Dickens and Shakespeare, or which of course they'll have to do some of these things anyway, or if they're going, although not in academies, or if they're going to do something which looks at post-colonial literature or something more exciting, or because these things often appear in grammar schools, if they're going to go with something very, very traditional. And so on. So there's lots and lots of freedom in here, and therefore we get lots of scope for people to be invested in the curriculum they teach, because they are designing it, they have an active role in designing it, they make it what they want, they make it appropriate, so we can get very tailor-made curricula that play to the interests of the students in the school potentially, or the school as a whole, or maybe to the staff. So there are drawbacks as well, because equally these kinds of curricula might never be pushed on, because the whole role of senior leaders in this kind of model is not to challenge curricular thinking in English or maths or arts or sciences or whatever. It's to let them do their best, which really relies therefore on having really highly capable and qualified people doing those roles. And qualified, I mean qualified to teach a curriculum, and therefore the idea is quite often in these models you'll find you get people who've been teaching a very long time are appointed into these roles, or who have really, really good subject knowledge or higher level qualifications, so that they can make those complex curricula decisions. Model 2, I'm calling centralized curriculum leadership. So in this sense, what we do is almost the opposite of what we've just seen there. And we try and centralize the decisions about curriculum. But because it's really hard to do that, not least because in order to centralize your curriculum decisions, you'd have to be an expert in all the subjects. And that, I'm sure there are one or two people out there who might be able to fulfill a role like that and be experts in the sciences and the arts and everything. But it's short of finding, 2,500 polymaths to do this job, I think you'd really struggle. What we therefore see is what Ofsted was mostly criticising, actually, I think, in their curriculum research, which is the shift over to a centralised, pedagogy focused curriculum lead. So that curriculum isn't about what you teach, it's about how you teach. So that idea of pedagogy being most important. So what happened in this model, and this model was dominant for a very long time, and still in some places is dominant, was you had somebody in charge of deciding what pedagogy would work best. And therefore the pedagogy lead would effectively be the curriculum lead, and they would be telling subjects, you teach what you want to teach and you decide what you're going to teach, but you need to do it within the parameters of these particular pedagogies. And that's led to all kinds of problematic things coming through that, again, the Ofsted research noted. But we'll get onto that in a second. So the positives here, we've got some really clear connections with the whole school direction. So the school can set out and say, we absolutely want our children to be involved in independent tasks a lot. We want them to be able to do independent research. We absolutely want our children to be doing group work as well as individual work. So there were lots of ways to tie up school ethos with the pedagogy and enforce it and ensure it was happening, because you can go out and you can see pedagogy happening. You can't necessarily see it well, but you can see at least a lip service to it, And again, I've worked in a school like this where we were very much told that teachers shouldn't be talking for a lot of time. Students should be doing a lot of work. Students should be doing work on their own, or preferably in groups and working things out for themselves. Students should be trying to work things out from first principles. So if somebody was coming round to see what was happening on my lessons and I knew that was happening, I would just make sure that I demonstrated that particular set of pedagogical tools at that point. Flipped learning was another good example of this. You shouldn't be teaching an awful lot of content in lessons. You should be sending them away to do that learning. And okay, if I was going to be observed, I'd set a pre-learning homework task before and somebody come in and see that. But in reality, it jarred with what I thought would be effective in lessons. And so there's that game always going on in these kinds of leadership. So The other positive, I suppose, just like in the previous model, is the curriculum leader at the senior leadership level doesn't really need an awful lot of expertise to do this in terms of the subject. All they need is some expertise in and around ideas of pedagogy. And actually, this is really interesting because we are seeing this as well with what we might term the knowledge turn in education, the research turn in education. We see lots of this coming into in the name of Ofsted, actually, in the way Ofsted's phrased, but we see lots of this coming into how we put cognitive psychology, cognitive science into lessons. So we've now got people in charge of telling subjects to make sure you put in a subject knowledge quick test every lesson. Make sure you've got plenty of opportunities for recall. Make sure you space out your retrieval practice. And some of those things might be good advice, but it depends really what you're teaching as to what's going to be appropriate. I know some schools are even down to the point of specifying that students should not be doing group work and teachers should be talking an awful lot. And actually, those things have their place, but it depends. For me, pedagogical decisions need to come from what I'm teaching. Okay, so the drawbacks I think are starting to become evident with this. Subject differences, again, are steamrolled. So if we put in a pedagogical directive, and let's take one of the ones Ofsted was criticising, such as teachers mustn't talk for more than 5 minutes, which I've definitely been told in my career, you must not be talking for longer than 5 minutes. Well, how do you teach history without doing some extended talking? Because the whole essence of history is around story and argument, and that involves talk and discussion. Students must always be engaged in group work. Again, problematic because, with the best will in the world, if you want to write a really good essay, yes, you might prepare for writing that essay with some oral rehearsal and argument. Jim Carroll's talked amazingly about that, but actually at some point you've got to write that and you've got to sit down, you've just got to work on it. Flipped learning. Again, lots of what children learn outside the classroom is incredibly complex, and lots of those misconceptions you have to deal with in the classroom. So they've got that issue. Secondly, it really devalues anything subject specific. So because the curriculum direction is pedagogical, what becomes important is generic pedagogy and not curricular thinking in a subject. So when in the school I worked in, I used to ask to go and do some subject specific training. Maybe there was a course on in fact there was one about being run by Christopher Clark actually on the course of the First World War. I said I'd love to go to that, it'd be great and really enable me to teach the First World War better, which we did at GCSE. And the answer to that was, that's not the kind of CPD we want you to go to. We are putting on some CPD on whatever it was, flipped learning or something else like that. Maybe it was VAC or Brain Gym or something. And therefore, what does it do? Well, it leads to all kinds of problems because I now become disaffected not because I'm just awkward, although I am, but because I know what I need to develop, and I know that there are some subject specific things I need to do. And yes, there are some whole school things that are useful as well. But if I want to get better at teaching history, I want some history specific input. And so that lack of buy-in becomes really problematic because now I'm almost being told how I have to teach, and therefore we start to see some of those problems that I think feed into the retention crisis in teaching, that I become detached and deprofessionalized by having my decision-making power taken away. And that was true as a head of department, but it's equally true of classroom teachers who are deprofessionalized because they are told how they have to teach, even if it's not appropriate. And so we get that lack of buy-in as well. So I think Christine Council refers to this as doing kind of curricular violence, which I think is absolutely true. So there are all kinds of problems with this model. And so the third model is basically an amplification of the second model I've just showed you there. But in this case, what we do is we end up with a range of curriculum leads who are all given kind of different responsibilities that are actually technically very much overlapping, but are seen as separate things. And so we may end up with a teaching and learning lead, an assessment lead, a raising attainment lead, a literacy lead. And all of these people are trying to then put in policies and strategies and things that teachers have to do, which impinge on the way that subjects want to teach, and therefore they create all the same problems as in the curriculum model 2 that we've just looked at, but now amplify that and really tear subjects between all kinds of different directions and create all kinds of chaos. And actually we're seeing this happening again when we start to see schools do things like create a curriculum lead for curriculum intent, a curriculum implementation, and curriculum impact. And of course, you can't separate those things, just as you can't separate assessment from what you're teaching, from the teaching and learning that you need to put in place. And those things really belong in what's happening in particular subjects and subject-specific pedagogies and approaches related to the particular curricula they're teaching. And you don't get that in this model. What you get is a lot of problems being raised. So I don't want to spend ages on this because this is more to do with curriculum leadership than it is to do with understanding why we're focusing on curriculum. But if we have a look in the Ofsted framework and we look at how they talk about leadership of curriculum, we will see that actually what they want is not really centralized curriculum leadership. And it wouldn't matter if they wanted it or not, but what's being judged is something very different, because actually the curriculum leadership they're interested in is something that happens both at a senior level and a subject level. So there's got to be that distinctiveness in there. You can't just have a model where nobody's in charge centrally, as in model 1, and you can't just have a model where somebody is put in charge of all pedagogical decisions and it just goes over subject. It's got to be both. So with that question of how leaders are thinking about endpoints, how the curriculum is building towards those endpoints, how the curriculum's been sequenced, how leaders have ensured the curriculum contains content which is useful. I hate that phrase, most useful, but anyway, but it's got content in it that people think is important, that it's taught in logically, that it's taught systematically, that people actually acquire that knowledge and skill. All of those conversations and all those discussions happen with senior leaders, but they also happen with subject leaders as well. And so whatever happens moving forwards, there needs to be a model of curriculum leadership, I think, which incorporates both those elements. Now that brings me quite nicely to model 4, which I'm calling distributed curriculum leadership. So this is my extra model that I'm putting in here for you, because I think this solves a lot of those problems. This is where we have curriculum leaders centrally, SLT curriculum leaders, who relate to leaders in particular subjects. And so in this model, what we would have is a curriculum leader who might be responsible for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 subjects maybe, and they communicate with subject specific leaders. So it's very much like a model 1 with the detached model, but now connecting up with somebody centrally who's kind of keeping oversight of everything and thinking about whether or not the subjects are fulfilling a whole school purpose, and then the subjects are being left to think about what's the most appropriate ways to teach and communicate and plan a curriculum in the subject. So what do we get there? Lots of freedom for subjects to plan their own things, lots of scope for staff to go off and do staff development subject specific and maybe subject knowledge based rather than just pedagogical, but it could be subject pedagogy as well. Lots of opportunities for whole school monitoring, because there is a conversation in this model that will happen between the head of maths and the SLT member in charge of maths and English and science or whatever. There is a unification of purpose, because that discussion involves unifying, well, okay, I can see you're teaching this curriculum, but in our whole school approach, we think it's important students are challenging injustice. How maybe does your curriculum help you do that? That's just one example. Or that we think it's important that students develop a range of practical work skills. How does your curriculum fit with this? And if it doesn't, that's a conversation to have there as well. But it's about leadership at both levels. Crucially, I also think this is about saying, if you're going to have leadership in subject areas, those subject leads, let's say the subject lead of English, should also be thinking about, how do I have those discussions with the people who work in the English department? So that it's not just about one person making a decision there, it's about distributing from the SLT at the centre to English and the head of English, but it's also about distributing from the head of English down to the people who teach English and say, okay, what are our students struggling with? Where is our curriculum working? Where is it not working? How could we be assessing this better? What could we be teaching that we're not now? That's where this is a really powerful model, because it's about discussion at all levels. What are the drawbacks? Well, very few for me, apart from the fact that the curriculum leaders who are in charge of this are going to need a hell of a lot of knowledge of the subjects they're in charge of, and it requires people who are in charge of individual subjects and who are in individual subjects being able to have those meaningful conversations with their heads of department so that this can be moved forward. That is entirely something we can deal with, largely through subject-specific training for teachers, and for senior leaders, getting to know different subjects. And it's not impossible. There's a whole range of support on this that you can get access to. And actually, I know it works, because I've got a colleague who does this in a school and is in charge of several subjects, and they do these conversations. Up to this point, I've talked an awful lot about Ofsted and why curriculum is important in terms of Ofsted and the shifting focus of Ofsted, but I don't want to leave it there. And I want to finish by talking about the fact that curriculum is so much more than Ofsted. And the reason why curriculum is important, well, we just have to look out the window at the moment and see the whole range of issues that are coming to the surface right now in this country and in other countries around the world because of a whole range of problems in the way that curriculum has been taught and a whole range of other structural injustices as well. But curriculum is part of that. Curriculum thinking carefully about what we teach and why we teach it, is crucial because in lots of curriculum constructions, either intentionally or unintentionally, all kinds of voices are silenced and all kinds of stories are not told. And as a history teacher, that's incredibly important, incredibly central to what I do. And I know it will be in English and in art and a whole range of other humanities disciplines. But equally, it's just as important in science in terms of, who we teach about in terms of particular discoveries. For example. So there are big questions. Why is curriculum important? Because curriculum allows us to either foreground and think about and directly address some of the injustices that we see in the world, and to look at the context in which Britain operates today, and shows that, if we talk about decolonisation, shows the colonial impacts Britain still has today. So we can either foreground those things as part of curriculum and say that that's important, or we can leave them unsaid and unaddressed and under the surface, and therefore we miss a really great opportunity to do something meaningful with students, to get them to think more deeply about the world that they live in. And so the question of why curriculum is important is because it isn't just a list of content. And if you look at the Ofsted framework, it actually really doesn't go an awful lot beyond the very practical uses of curriculum as a stepping stone to the next thing, or providing cultural capital in inverted commas. And that of course is a very loaded term. So it doesn't actually address that issue of what is cultural capital, whose cultural capital should we be giving, what are the exercises in power that are happening in curriculum right now, and do we need to do something different about those as a school? All of that is important, I think. And if we think deeply about curriculum, then we get to address those issues. And so curriculum is about all kinds of things other than just what we learn. Curriculum is about identity. It's about identity as a school and what our school stands for. It's about identity for individuals and the pupil and the teachers, actually. Curriculum and the curriculum decisions we make are about our own identity as teachers and what we want to promote. Because actually, whether or not you have a fixed curriculum or a curriculum that's in place, every time you pick up a lesson and you teach it, you will teach it in a particular way to your students. You'll teach it for those students, hopefully, and you will adapt it in subtle ways for those students. And the question is, how do you adapt it? Because that will be shaped by curricular thinking. When you teach in particular ways, it's curricular thinking. When you choose to assess in particular ways, it's curricular thinking. And when you choose to take a different tack on something, that's curricular thinking. And that's really, really important. Of course, it's also important to pupils. It helps them develop a sense of identity. And if we do it badly, it helps them see that their identity doesn't fit with the identity of a school or a classroom or a community. And that is hugely problematic and we need to address it. And of course, in totality and over time, those curricular decisions shape our identity as a wider community, as a country, and potentially as an international community as well. And I think it's really interesting how we are seeing shifts happening at the moment. And that's partly because people have thought quite deeply about curriculum decisions in the past, but not everybody, and probably not enough. So curriculum is identity. Curriculum is an opportunity, as Will Bailey Watson puts it here. Curriculum is an opportunity to think more broadly about what the purpose of schooling is, because if we don't begin there, everything else will fall to pieces. Okay, so hopefully this has been a useful introduction to why we're focusing on curriculum so much, and hopefully just that final bit on why it's so important too. As we move on then, the next session is going to be looking at a particular model of curriculum. So we're going to ask that big question, what actually is curriculum? We've talked about it an awful lot, but not really defined it. And we're going to look at a model, the traditional model of curriculum. And we'll think about what that is and what that means, and then we'll go on, as I said, some more generic, broad sessions, thinking about curriculum up to session 4, and then into some history specific stuff later on. I would love to get any comments or questions that you have in the comments down below. After this, there's a bibliography if you'd like access to that as well. Thanks ever so much for listening.